I'm going to go ahead and get started now. Welcome everybody to the July 15th EPAC meeting. It's been a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks since we were last together. On the last meeting, we had gone through the final results from the first scenario of the capacity expansion modeling runs for the CGPP, and started in on going through the utilities siting methodology, where we're translating those zonal capacity expansion model results into a more granular nodal model. We were able to, I believe, get through the first section of the slides, kind of the overview slides, and we were about to dig in deeper, but we ran out of time last time. So that's where we're going to pick up today. We're going to go through the remainder of the siting methodology and allow folks some time to ask questions about that and review that. And then with the remaining time of the day, we're going to try and go through the scenario 2 results from the capacity expansion model. These results hopefully, will look very similar. We're presenting a lot of the similar data in similar formats, with some obviously new results because it's a different scenario with different underlying assumptions. But I'm hoping that this can go a little bit faster than the presentation of the scenario 1 results, because now we're kind of familiar with the types of results. So hopefully we can get both of those presentations in today. But we will most likely need to be scheduling another EPAC meeting here in the next couple weeks anyway, because we will hopefully have another set of capacity expansion modeling results sometime in early August to share with folks. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to the JU folks to start walking through that siting methodology presentation again. And feel free to share slides too.
Yep, hello, this is Jeff Marr from National Grid's Transition Planning Group. I'm just going to try to share. Sorry, it's having a little bit of a headache here. Let's try this. Okay.
You're sharing your screen now.
Great. So this was the presentation we had gone through last time. I'm going to jump in to just level set as a reminder here on slide 3.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
Well, we're just seeing the, at least me, I'm just seeing the WebEx.
Okay, hold on a second. Sorry. Sorry about this. Okay, how about now?
Yes, now we're seeing slide 1.
Great, okay. So we're going to jump right in to slide 3. So slide 3 here is just giving people a reminder of what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to do is take in stage 1, we have these capacity expansion results, which are on a zonal level. And in stages 2 and 3 and onward, what we need is power flow modeling data that is very granular, right? So you take these zonal resources and they have to be placed in very specific points in the system in order to perform the analysis in stages 3 and 4. So to get between stage 1 and stage 2, we need to come up with a methodology to place those resources on a nodal level, right? At the bus level, reflecting all of the different inputs that we have, how can we decide where to place all these zonal resources in order to build these models in stage 2? So what we're here today to talk about is this nodal placement. What is our proposal for how we're going to do that? So I think where we had left off last time was we were at a very high level looking at this kind of sequence here, start to finish. So we would start with the NYSO's interconnection queue, move into using the utility's headroom calculations, consider if the headroom becomes limited at certain locations, consider adding midline connections. We'll get into a little bit more detail on all these points in a second. And then finally, once we've exhausted headroom, we're going to have to add, and if there's areas where we have to continue to add more resources, we will look at where they've already been placed in the model in the previous steps and continue to add resources into those locations. At the end, we're going to spend some time validating, using engineering judgment, make sure what we've created, how we've placed all these resources makes sense. So that's where we were last time. Now we'll get into a little bit of detail. So as I mentioned, we'll start with the interconnection queue. So the idea here is to look at all resources that are at stage 6 or later in the interconnection process. Now, I know the timing is not perfect on this as the NYISO is moving into the new Order 2023 compliant interconnection process. So we're going to use the best information we have available for resources that completed an interconnection study at the SRIS. Stage 6 is the completion of the SRIS. So we'll look at the interconnection queue, find all those projects that have completed an interconnection study, and place them at the POI at which the project is currently planned. So place them in the explicit location that they were studied. The supply curve data and county level capacity expansion results will be considered. So for example, we would skip a resource if it's located in an area that is already saturated to levels of the CapEx model. So we're not going to go beyond what the capacity expansion models are recommending for these areas. Once we've completed placing the resources based on the interconnection queue, we move on to our next step. So the next step is to look at available headroom. So every year, every other year, the utilities have been, every year we've been publishing headroom calculations. Those are out in the docket, the 20E0197. So those locations where we believe there is electrical headroom that could support new generation are in that filing. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at that filing, find the locations where there is headroom, and place resources on those buses. Again, we'll prioritize the stations county by county based on where the capacity can be located. Prioritization would follow roughly based on existing or planned stations that are expandable. This means like existing station resources are retiring, perhaps, or stations where we know that there is space. We'll also spend some time evaluating stations that may have headroom but are not physically suitable for interconnecting resources. In those instances, we may have to place generation on the lines that lead to the station as long as the lines could support that. But this is available headroom, right? So this is step 2. This is available headroom that already exists today. Next, we'll move on to step 3. Again, this is looking at the line locations. So consider a station that may not have any more headroom remaining. If the lines in that vicinity of that station appear to be able to support additional generation, we will consider connecting them directly to the lines. The idea here would be we would place the resources in the middle of a line because we don't really know exactly where the generation would locate. Could be near one end or the other. But given the lack of information at this stage, because again, remember, these are not resources that are in the interconnection queue. These are, unknown resources. We would consider placing them in the middle of the line. Finally, we move to step 4. Once we've exhausted headroom, right? So we used the interconnection queue, we used headroom, we considered midline interconnection points. We've got no clear locations left because the headroom is now all been utilized. What we will do is place incremental resources at sites where these resources have already been placed, right? So again, the interconnection queue or stations where there were headroom, and then continue adding more resources. This will be done using engineering judgment, considering population density, flood zones, state parks, etc., all the things that would go into potentially making this interconnection point viable. We're also considering using something called something that came from our consultant that's helping us create these cases, and that's what we call a strong bus analysis to screen out areas where interconnection is unlikely to be feasible. Okay, now once we've placed all these resources following steps 1 through 4, step 5 is a sanity check, right? We want to make sure that where we end up reflects initial zonal assumptions, right? We want to make sure we're consistent with those zonal assumptions, and we want to make sure that what we're placing looks reasonable. I did skip over it, but in some of the previous slides from last time, we discussed how much generation we would place at existing buses based on the voltage, based on how much we think that those voltage levels could support. So we want to go through and make sure that we kind of held true to our guiding, mileposts here, and that what we ended up with makes some engineering sense. Just to reinforce this idea of where we might have to place resources in the middle of a line. So for example, a station may not be expandable, but that even though that station is not expandable, there might be, a field that the vicinity of that station would be physically capable of having renewables or other types of generation build out in that vicinity. So the approach here would be to bisect the lines, place the generation on the new line so it does not need to be placed at the specific station, right? So placing it essentially in the middle of the line. Again, this would attempt to consider land use constraints or restrictions from the NYSERDA integration analysis. And we would consider the line capability when doing this, right? So if the line was only good for, let's say 100 megawatts, we wouldn't try to put 1,000 megawatts on that line. That wouldn't make sense. So we will try to respect the line capabilities when we go through this. The final thing to mention here is siting of DER. So most of the scenarios, I think all 3 of the scenarios have quite a large DER build out. So what we'll do with the DER is this will be modeled separately from the other types of resources, right? So we will not be lumping together wholesale and retail solar, for example. We would explicitly model the large scale renewables, explicitly modeling the behind the meter PV, for example. And what we will do for the DER, it will be informed by the utility's hosting capacity calculations. So each of the utilities has been doing work in this space to look at forecasting to determine how, not only how much resource might show up in their area, but also locational wise across their service territories. So we're going to be leveraging that information that's already out there, right? You can find hosting capacity maps published by the utilities. They're out there today. So we'll be using that information to help inform where we'll be placing the DER. Now, we will make sure that at the end of the day, we match what we put in the model to what was in the forecast, right? So even if our internal, or even if the utilities forecasts don't all sum up to what was assumed in the capacity expansion model inputs, we will make sure through scaling on a zonal basis that the DER does match. And just here on below is just one example of I think one of the scenarios DER assumptions. So we will make sure that this is actually, we do have the numbers disaggregated into the individual zones, and we will make sure that those individual zones match what was assumed in the capacity expansion models. I realize that was fairly quick. I'm welcome to take questions.
Anna.
Thanks, Heather. And thanks, Jeffrey, for that presentation. How will you be modeling battery storage paired with renewables?
Yeah, good question. It's something we've been working through even just recently. We'll follow a very similar sequence of steps, right? So we will use the interconnection queue as an indicator. We will use headroom as an indicator, right? Because headroom does matter to storage discharge as much as it matters to like generation from renewables or even deferred generation. Like the headroom is an indicator of how much the system can support regardless of generation type. So we're pretty much going to follow the same sequence of steps. To the extent possible, we will likely co-locate storage and renewables, at least upstate. Now, that does not mean that we think that they will be like behind the inverter co-located. Again, these models are meant to represent kind of across an area where we think the hot pockets of generation and storage would be. So we expect to probably use the existing locations in the bus as a proxy, or in the model as a proxy almost. So we would likely model a bus to have, it could have solar, it could have wind, it could have storage, all in that same bus. That doesn't mean, again, that they're all the same company or all the same resources or all the same inverter. It just means that in that direct vicinity, we think those resources would all be connecting. So yeah, so it would basically be following the same sequence of steps.
And then are you creating, so I imagine that you're picking a few hours that you think might be important, like summer peak, winter peak, for example. Do you need to run some sort of production cost model to understand when the battery storage would be dispatched, or are you just going to assume that it's on when for the hour that you're looking at, or the hours that you're looking at?
Yeah, so the conditions that we're looking at are actually defined as part of the CGPP process, right? So we're looking at a summer peak, a winter peak, a light load, and a shoulder load.
Okay.
So those are already defined. Within each case, we'll be making an assumption about what the storage can do, likely reflective of the renewable generation. So in a period, for example, light load case, when there's significant output from renewables, we would have storage charging. During a period, say a peak load period, those ones could get a little more complicated. It might depend regionally. If it's a peak load period and there is still a lot of renewable generation, that generation or that storage may be able to charge. But if it's at the same point or same time in the system, for example, maybe downstate where you might need the energy from the storage, we might have to assume that storage is discharging at that time. So it would reflect kind of regional considerations. The NYISO has provided, as part of their capacity expansion modeling, they have some representative days, which are we're going to use to help inform our decisions for each case and year.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that.
Okay, I saw Kopi's hand next.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is Kofi representing ACE New York here. Could you talk a little bit about just what resources exactly I'm modeling? Are you just modeling UPV, land-based wind, offshore wind, and storage? And what sort of dispatches will be assumed for those? And also, what are your thoughts on NYISO, including electrolysis load? Are you planning to model any of that? So I think that the capacity expansion model did over a lot of resources like electrolysis load, hydrogen, differs. And the question is, are you modeling all of that, or are you just choosing a subset, like the traditional renewables to model? Thank you.
Yeah, so we're modeling everything that came out of the capacity expansion model. And I guess you could say everything that went into the capacity expansion model as an input. So all the load assumptions that went in, all the DER assumptions that went into the model, those will be into the capacity expansion model. Those will be captured in the power flow model. And then all of the outputs from the capacity expansion model will be captured in the power flow. So that includes the UPV, the land-based wind, the offshore wind, the storage, the defers, the electrolysis load. All of these things will be modeled in the power flow cases.
Right. And how would you dispatch all of them? Is that when you would end up going back to NISO's 13 representative days to get a snapshot and model it exactly? Or could you elaborate on that? Or if you're not there yet, I think that's also fine.
So this is one we I think are going to tackle a little bit more as we move into stage 2. I will say that I believe the CGPP order tells us to model the renewables at 100% dispatch or 100% nameplate, 100% nameplate. So if my memory is correct and that's what the order says, that's what we will do.
All right, sounds good. And at the end, could you share the list of POIs you end up putting these resources for transparency? At least once that placement is done, your modeling is done, I think a list would be helpful to stakeholders. But thank you very much.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I saw Raya's hand next.
Oh, hello. Thank you for the presentation. If you could walk me and I guess walk us through what your plans are for this piece of the process to comply with the LCPA's requirements to prioritize emissions and co-pollutant reductions in disadvantaged communities, provide benefit to disadvantaged communities, and ensure there is no disproportionate burden placed on disadvantaged communities.
Yeah, thanks for the question. This one is a tough one for us. I think for sure what we decided is we will not be modeling any combustion, even if it is hydrogen, within disadvantaged communities. But beyond that, we don't have a clear picture of whether, for example, solar build out would be viewed as good or bad, or land-based wind would be viewed as good or bad. So what I think are intending to do is model this based on the electric system's capability to support those resources. Again, these models are somewhat of a proxy, right? So we're modeling, for example, the connection of resources at a specific point in the system, but that is meant to represent connection within that area. So that area could be anything from a couple of miles to 10 or 20 miles around the vicinity of that explicit point that electric model represents. So from that perspective, picking a point within our model, it's very difficult to say that is within a disadvantaged community or not, because it could just be, again, as a proxy to represent a generator that's connecting right along the border of a disadvantaged community, for example. So the capacity expansion model is really dictating to us how much generation we have to place in each one of these regions. And these disadvantaged communities often represent just a very small, potentially very, very small proportion of the zones that we're modeling. So the electric system models that we have are not really developed to reflect those very small constraints within disadvantaged communities. We would expect that as the actual resources get developed, those would reflect, any limitations regarding disadvantaged communities. And as we move through the cycles of CGPP, it would be refined to reflect more accurate data.
So you're saying
cycle.
that you do not have a plan to address the CLCPA's requirements at this point because you either cannot or will not.
Yeah, it's not a matter of will not, it's a matter of our electrical models just aren't designed to reflect that constraint. That's even the capacity expansion models, the power flow models, none of them reflect that constraint. And quite frankly, I don't think most of us know exactly how some of these technologies would be viewed in that context.
Have you seen the, I think it was the Climate Justice Working Group's Barriers and Opportunities report for renewables that came out of the CLCPA process?
As part of the scoping plan work?
Yeah.
It's been a while, but I do recall seeing it.
Yeah, I guess I I guess I reject the notion that we are unable to at least gather the information that's needed. You know, we're talking about clearing connection queues. We're talking about certain areas. We know where these areas are, especially, of course, in New York City. I mean, New York City, Buffalo, et cetera. I know I've talked a lot with various folks about how do we even start to just put markers in so that we can, be it through energy communities or other information we have, so we can even begin to even track what we're looking at. And I reject the notion that there's nothing that we can do. And I actually assert that if folks go forward without, you know, sort of, and I think we should be productively trying to put our heads together on it, that will not be compliant with the CLCPA. And I think that be it that we have a different process, or be it that we figure out how to pour more resources through this process, but this idea that this is something that we can wait until, you know, stages 2, 3, 4, and 5, I think is not workable. So I hear you that there are constraints, but I think that it is the mandate of the utilities to comply with the law.
But now, just as a reminder, I did say that we would be avoiding placement of any combustion technologies within disadvantaged communities.
Well, that's my thing. If you know, if you know you're not going to be doing it within those boundaries, why aren't we able to track other things that may be happening in those boundaries? Even just identifying and tracking would be better than nothing. So if we know where those resources are going to go, and you can tell that it shouldn't be combustion, then you should be able to track what's happening at the very least.
So combustion technologies are essentially a postage stamp compared to these renewable technologies, which are massive in scale. So it's much easier to consider where those combustion technologies would be physically located.
I hear that I get what you're saying, but I think maybe what I'm saying is it could be valuable to have a conversation on what you may be able to track versus not, even just so that we aren't skipping CLCPA mandates in this phase. It sounds like there might be a way to figure out something, is what I'm hearing. You've started figuring out something in terms of combustion. And I hear you about postage stamp, but also don't fully understand, because we're talking about battery storage, we're talking about distributed generation, and we're talking about pre-existing queues. So I'm just, I'm not maybe you could clarify what you mean in terms of the postage stamp. But short of having a broader conversation, here, which I would, be happy to do, it sounds like that there's a piece that's missing in this process.
Yeah, maybe for context, I'll offer that the interconnection queue, or the interconnection queues, are helping us understand really a very small percentage of the resources that are being built by these capacity expansion models. So very large percentage of the resources are outside of those very specific interconnection points.
Mm-hmm. And I know there's interconnection, I got it, headroom, major buses, interconnection. You presented it as a part of the picture, and that's my point, though. I think there are a lot of there's a lot of data here, and I just want to make sure there's not a piece that's missing. It looks like there is. So I guess I'm saying is that it would be great, or that would be the ask, if we could have, it might be that we need maybe we need an EPAC meeting that's fully dedicated to this topic. Maybe we need some type of other discussion, but it sounds like there's some fleshing out that needs to be done. Can we, I guess, just can we have a discussion? Either, it sounds like we need to have some type of discussion. DPS, Can you save us here?
So we're going to have two opportunities this summer to have potentially a discussion on this. One is in a technical conference for all stakeholders, and one is going to be in a EJ DAC focused tech conference that'll be coming up in August at some point. Trying to get that on the schedule right now. I think we might be talking past each other a little bit because they're still in the plans, like to obviously track where all these things are cited. We'll have all that information. But underlying
No,
this
but I'm
whole
hearing
thing,
opposite. That's why I'm pushing here, because I'm hearing the opposite. I'm hearing that it
No.
can't be tracked.
well,
And I've
well,
heard that
we
in
are tra-
previous discussions that it can't be tracked. And basically, I feel that for stage one, we've just been hearing that there's nothing that can be done.
So
That's what I'm
yes,
hearing
in
again and
stage-
again, despite
Okay.
many
Yes.
different recommendations that have been made.
Yeah, we've heard this. We've heard the same recommendation. The situation still remains the same. The stage one capacity expansion modeling has not changed since we've gone over that. It's still a zonal representation of resources, so there still is no way to say, which of those resources is in a disadvantaged community or is good to be there or is not good to be there, or we want to focus in disadvantaged communities. But in this, as we move into stage two, which is where we're trying to move through with the siting methodology, we're now able to make more decisions about, based on specific interconnection points that we're seeing in the interconnection queue, what substations might these megawatts show
Well,
up
I
at? We
understand
still
that,
don't know.
which is why I'm pushing here
I
now,
am
because it
trying to
doesn't.
tell the story and
No, I
get you what you're
understand,
looking
but
for.
I'm interrupting because what I'm saying is that this was my question to this plan that was presented. What is the plan to comply with the CLCPA? And I was told that we don't have one because we don't have a clear picture of how to do it.
This process is part of the CLCPA compliance. Actually, this process is born out of the AREGBA. CLCPA compliance is about building those systems and reducing the decarbonization. I think we're actually kind of beyond what's useful for this EPAC meeting, because we're kind of talking about definitions within the law, when the CLCPA is about achievement of these resource mandates and emissions reductions based on physically locating assets, and we're modeling abstract concepts. We're modeling megawatts showing up at substations. We might know where those substations are, which is what Jeff's been talking about, but what his message about renewables versus existing power plants, we know where those existing power plants are to a very granular detail. We do not necessarily know where the new megawatts might physically be located in a zip code or in a geography. And so while we are able to track megawatts at substations, which is something we've already committed to present at some point to EPAC to show like where some of these are, so we can track certain locations that have significant build outs of different resources, we're not necessarily going to be able to say with perfect attribution, like this DAC zip code has this many megawatts of this generator.
Again, I'm only interrupting because I understand this, so
Okay.
again, I
It's
understand
great.
this, but I guess my point is that, I
Thank you.
asked what the plan
Raya.
was. We're told there's not one because folks don't fully understand how to do it. I understand that I'm hearing for the first time that there's something you want to do specifically on environmental justice. I don't know. To me, I'm not sure that that's an appropriate approach. Because I'm just concerned that outside of that subset, that the plan and understanding amongst both the utilities and EPS in terms of how to best address this topic, it just doesn't seem, I'm just not sure the commitment is there. So anyway, we can stop. I will stop, but I'm just, just sort of raising this flag, and I hope to have deeper conversations about it.
7:15.
Okay, I saw Jonathan's hand next.
Yeah, thanks. Question for Jeff. I'm curious of what you would think the implications would be when you indicated that you're going to be placing first the resources at the stations that can be expanded, and then and then afterwards, somewhere along lines, and I guess what the implication would be in the network model development phase, to have more resources either on the line versus at the station, would you expect to see a different build out based on that? I guess the reason I'm raising it, I guess, is in siting, we've been seeing more projects actually tapping lines rather than actually interconnecting directly to stations, just based on proximity of the projects to stations. They prefer to, interconnect into a line tap that's much closer to their facility than building a longer transmission line to interconnect at a station. Or maybe that's driven by the interconnection queue if they have indicated, that they're tapping a station versus a line. And so really the question is just what would the implication be of the build out if you're tapping more, you're placing more projects on a line versus at a station?
Yeah, this one's a very difficult one, honestly. It may not matter, or it could be very significant. So why I kind of joke a little bit is there are transmission lines out there, especially like 100 kV type transmission facilities that have ratings that are on the order of 100 megawatts or so. Okay, so that's going to suggest to us that those lines would not be a great candidate to connect, say, 500 megawatts of generation, right? The line itself would just not be able to support it. Now, the substation, right? Many of these substations may have half a dozen lines at them. So by connecting directly to the substation, there's a perception that you may be able to get more out of that area. So one way to kind of think about this would be like if a project was trying to connect into the middle of a line somewhere, that very, very specific issue to that project about whether that line could support them is something that is very likely to show up in the interconnection study. So CGPP here, we might build out the network to support generation in this area, but that generator may still pick a poor line to connect to. So they may have to, within the interconnection study, figure out how or what upgrades they may need to help get them deliverable because of their connection to that line instead of that station. I mean, that's a possible way it could play out. That's probably an extreme bookend way that it could play out. The other kind of bookend is connecting to the line has pretty much the same system response as connecting to the station. So what we expect is when we get into this is we will be examining the system performance using these substations as kind of a proxy for where generation has shown tremendous interest in the area. To the extent that that substation, when we go through our siting methodology, is kind of filled up, we've kind of cited the maximum amount of generation we can at that location, and we start looking at the lines around that substation. To the extent that problems are identified, they would be captured through this CGPP process. To the extent that there are no problems with that, that would be fantastic. But it's really a big uncertainty right now. Even the idea of, if you were to connect to the line right outside the substation versus connecting to the line kind of in the dead center of the circuit, you could see slightly different results. But we just don't know. There's just so much uncertainty right now about where physically these resources would be located that through this process, we just have to assume something. So what we're proposing to assume is that we will connect the resources at the substation. And then if the substation becomes fully subscribed, we would then look at the lines as a secondary interconnection.
This is Frank Walsh from NYSEG Gardini. I would just chime in that this type of simplifying assumption is broadly consistent with the other types of decisions we'll have to make. Right. So by assuming that we can connect to the substations, right, as Jeff alluded to, that's generally the most efficient place to connect, because where you have multiple lines tapping in, you're able to leverage their sort of combined capacity. So similarly, when we're considering storage, we would tend to want to co-locate storage with generation, because that minimizes the need to use up your headroom in order to serve both your storage and your generation. So to the extent that the future plays out and it's not quite as efficient as our assumptions here, there's adjustments that can be made. But it is I think the best starting point for us to do this analysis, especially in light of the fact that the number of lines we have, that the number of permutations of different interconnection points and taps that are out there are for all intents and purposes, limitless. So it makes sense to focus our assumptions on what we think is the most efficient.
Thanks for jumping in, Frank.
All right, Chris.
Thanks, Skylar. Just a question, and then it's more like a comment question. Going back to the energy storage assumptions, did you look at the scenario where you might have a multi-day extreme weather event in the winter and how energy storage is recharged in that scenario? And then the second one would be if we had similarly like a wind law for multiple days, what's your assumption on energy storage recharge in that type of case? And then the last item would be more just recently, NYSERDA and DPS came out with their draft biennial report. How does that get incorporated in any of this analysis, or is it separate and distinct?
You can take that last part first and then hand it back over to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So the report is completely separate. You know, we've already locked down our assumptions for this model run, where we have, you know, certain generators as firm, some that might not even be under contract anymore, but they're, you know, roughly representative of advanced projects that are in the interconnection queue. So we can still kind of feel confident that even if they're not currently under contract, something in that area is likely to be built within this time frame. So there's not really necessarily anything in that report that changes the fact that we need to be compliant in this modeling run with 70 by 30 and 0 by 40. So right now, I would say that's a distinct process. Just to take a stab at answering the other questions about storage, we have an ELCC process that we start with all these resources, where we are trying to be compliant with the LCRs and the IRM, and each asset in the modeling toolkit has its own ELCC, or it's basically its capacity value rating based on the reserve margin, which is based on trying to make sure even in worst case scenarios, these loads can be met. However, the individual capacity expansion modeling run is an individual run. It's not necessarily a sequence of 1,000 permutations, including all of the worst case scenario events within each individual run. So I would say, to answer your question, broadly, this resource build out is consistent with maintaining reliability in a 0.1 LOLE framework, but we don't have any individual specific days or worst case scenarios that we've kind of primed or tested to see exactly how this specific mix reacts in those individual situations. We just have this broader kind of IRM consistency that gives us confidence that this is a reliable resource build out.
Okay, thanks, Skylar.
Nice. OJ, you folks, was that consistent with your understanding? Because that's kind of how I've been viewing kind of our approach. But we have taken back some other comments from folks earlier on, where it might make sense to, at some point, either in this process or outside of this process, kind of stress test some of these resource build outs for wind lulls or extreme weather events or something.
Yeah, I would maybe reinforce your last statement. I actually think you need to do that, because I mean, taking, say, what would be a normal set of facts and then doing a stress test to it, I think it may lead you to some additional outcomes that you have to consider. So I would definitely reinforce your point.
Thanks, Chris.
Skylar, I thought that was a great answer. Thanks for jumping in on that.
Sure. Bill.
Thanks, Skylar. Couple questions. One is I want to make sure that I understood Frank's comment earlier. I think said that you're looking at co-locating storage of renewables as much as possible to preserve the hosting capacity, and the concern being that sometimes storage will be co-located, but a lot of times you don't want to be co-located because you want the capacity from both resources at the same time at peak times. I want to check to see what was that statement that a lot was being co-located in the model or not? Can you explain the percentage of that, or did I just mishear?
I'm speaking in generalities, so that there may be instances where we don't do this, but as a general rule, we are seeking to co-locate storage with the renewable generation.
So when you model, you're gonna have possibly more than 50% of the storage modeled as if it's co-located with other generation, and you wouldn't be modeling both of them putting out power at the same time, or exceeding the peak of the single interconnection.
Yes, so there's still some finer points we'll have to put on this as we build out the actual dispatches, but just as a illustrative example, if we were to be studying a light load case and high renewable output, we would expect to see a higher risk of curtailment. So one benefit of having storage co-located is that we could use that as an opportunity to charge the storage, charge the batteries, therefore limiting curtailment under that snapshot, and also limiting the extent of any upgrades that might be required in that scenario.
Right, but I think you achieved that. And by the way, I love the earlier answer that you'll look at the operation of storage in such a way that in a light location you'd seek to charge it as opposed to trying to discharge, which makes a complete sense. I don't think it has to be co-located for that to occur. And my real concern is that if we co-locate it all, then on the super hot August day, when you want all the power you can possibly get from all the resources, if you've got the storage project and the solar project are co-located, you're only getting half power, for instance. And I don't think much of the state's going to get built out that way. I mean, some certainly will, but I doubt it will be over 50%. So I encourage us to relook at that assumption or how important it is for this.
Yeah, and I think when there's opportunities the models we're going to have in stage 2 are a starting point. And once we get in and start doing analysis, we will have the latitude to make modification to those placements if we think there's a more efficient build out that's possible. And I think one of the key points about trying to co-locate or locate resources efficiently as possible is that it's a longer term study. Our assumptions about where things are going to be located are speculative. And what we don't want to have happen is the identified upgrades be dependent on the assumptions that we make. Right. So by locating resources efficiently, we're doing our best to maximize the minimize the possibility for regrets down the line. If a particular assumption doesn't materialize, we don't want to undermine the need for an upgrade.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I fully agree that you want the model to be as accurate as possible, and you don't want to upgrades that would not be necessary. I guess you also run the inverse risk of modeling something that's not reality and not having it be consistent with the system that we're going to end up with. And I guess that gets to my second question, which is kind of the big news in the energy storage world between our last meeting and this meeting was the release of the energy storage roadmap by the Public Service Commission order. And in that order, and this gets a little bit to what Raya was talking about earlier, in that order, there are a few very interesting things. Clearly, the direct push for 6 gigawatts by 2030, the programs that support them, and particular constraints on those programs, geographic, disadvantaged communities, etc. How, to what extent is that going to be taken into consideration as you're looking at the capacity expansion? And maybe you can talk a little bit, and it's a broad question for the whole group, I guess, just talk a little bit about, in this kind of next stage of when you're starting to try to tie it more spatially in the state. What you're thinking is around that. I don't think both targets right now that are in the roadmap are completely consistent with what you have so far. So that would be worth taking a look at that.
I think I need to caution you, right? I mean, we locked down our assumptions many months ago, right? This process has to move forward. We can't constantly iterate every time a report comes out. So I think we have to continue forward based on our assumption matrix, which was kind of agreed to already. We did look at some of the key points from the roadmap, and we believe that we were generally consistent. The results just happened to generally be consistent with some of the guidance that's in the roadmap. But I think at this point we just can't iterate on our capacity expansion model results.
So I guess maybe you could talk a little bit about the next stage of we trying to get to more geographically granular looks, and that's where I'm thinking about this. And I would distinguish an order from the Public Service Commission from a report. I mean, this is much more what's really going to happen versus what people speculate might happen. So it's I realize that we don't want to throw away the work that's been done to date and restart. We definitely want to keep going where we are, but it's worth thinking a little bit about, especially if we start to look more granularly and start to look for substations and things like that. How can we consider some of Raya's points and some of the other points that are raised here, and particularly the actual order from the Public Service Commission.
Yeah, again, I'm going to say that we made our assumption matrix. It's locked. Now, when we do look at the storage order, again, I think it was the locational requirements that were in the order. We believe all of the capacity expansion model results are consistent with those locational requirements, at least on a zonal basis.
Yeah, there's also DAC requirements and other things, but I mean, it's worth a check, but thank you.
Yeah, that is the tough part about these multi-year processes. All those things will be baked into CGPP Cycle 2's modeling in about a year and a half, but we obviously didn't have things like 30 to 35% of the bulk program will be basically in zones G through K. We didn't have that as a constraint in the model. Like Jeff said, it appears that we're basically our results actually meet a lot of the requirements, and some of the ones that are not specific, like the retail program requirements, don't necessarily say which specific zone, which specific DAC is, just in general. Those are the ones that we might have some flexibility to choose siting within a zone to be compliant with the program, but there may be some constraints in our capacity expansion model results that we can't necessarily just like add 50 megawatts or add 100 megawatts of storage to a zone that wasn't there in the capacity expansion results. That's something we'd have to actually discuss probably more with NYISO and JU staff to see what might be able to be done to be more consistent. But yeah, this is going to be a tightrope to walk for us, at least for sure in the state scenario, but we're not fully sure about the other two yet.
Well, in this one, appreciate that, Skylar, and in this scenario, where it really plays, I think, is in the distributed storage distribution, which is less clear in the other. So it's I'm very curious to see how you fine tune the distributed distribution.
Right.
Thank you.
Kobe?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think to clear up most of these placement questions, it's going to be helpful, like extremely helpful, if after the placement is done, at least that the list per technology per zone is made public, obviously subject to CII requirements, but I think it's going to be very critical to make that list available as soon as you guys finalize it. So I think you should take it back and let us know if you disagree, but I think it's something that needs to be made available at the early stages once it's finalized.
Thanks.
Yeah, and then a question I have is, are you planning to model multiple years from the capacity expansion, or is the focus going to be just on 2030? Could you elaborate on that, or it's still for future discussion?
That's actually prescribed as part of the CGPP process. We're looking at 2030, 2035, and 2042.
Okay, and then for one question that just came to mind is for the DR modeling, is the dispatch going to be changed, or is it going to be just assumed as maximum all the time and netted with the load? Any thoughts on that?
So the large scale renewables, I think it's explicitly recommended how we model those in as part of the CGPP order. So I think with the DER, we might have a little bit more flexibility to reflect the conditions that are roughly in line with the cases that we're studying. Again, summer peak, winter peak, shoulder, light load. So we haven't actually confirmed exactly what the dispatch of the DER will be yet. So we're still discussing it.
Okay. And then what went into the cutoff of interconnection project stage 6 and above? I think if there's a need to find more POIs, you should probably look into lowering the limit instead of leaving it to some level of judgment. So especially for storage placement, I think if there are not enough storage projects stage 6 and above to meet the zonal distribution, I think it'll be prudent to consider lowering the bar from stage 6 to something else.
Yeah, the view of stage 6 was that it had completed a study, so we had an idea that the project and the developer had been informed of the potential risks of their project. The study had been performed to identify the potential system issues associated with that project. So it felt like quite a significant investment had been made in doing that analysis. Whereas, for example, a stage 1 project that has only just entered the interconnection queue, you know virtually nothing about it. So the thought was stage 6, there's some level of comfort that the developer is invested in the process and making progress.
Thank you.
Raya?
Hello, I just wanted to chime in because I had put something in the chat, just that more information is definitely better than less. Both in terms of, I think back when we were talking about I believe the storage order, you said that you had done some type of preliminary analysis and think that some of the pieces that you're doing are consistent with that order and some may be a little harder to figure out. To the extent that, I guess we'd ask that, if you could share information in terms of, just sort of regularly in terms of that in particular and other things. And certainly, if you haven't already, when do you think we're going to hear more in terms of the methodology, et cetera, about this piece in particular?
Thank you.
So the comment I made was really in reference to the zonal distribution. Again, that's where the capacity expansion model really lives, is at the zonal level. Mm-hmm. So at the extent that the storage order puts some zonal constraints around where storage should be developed, it appears that the capacity expansion model work that's been done thus far does comply with those zonal level requirements.
I assume that. Thank you for clarifying that. I just said more information if that we could have in terms of, what you're looking at in terms of how you're making these calculations, I think would be great. And then, the second piece is, when do you think we can see more info about these methodologies? I understand maybe not today, but is that something we can look to? I don't know, but in August, by the end of the year, or what are you thinking?
So I think all of the calculations that have been done thus far are based on the capacity expansion model matrix of assumptions, right? So those have already been out there. They've been locked down for quite a while. The next step is to try to place all these resources within the power flow models. And we're hearing a request that once we've done that placement, to be transparent about where the generation was placed. I think that would be the next step, is to be transparent about where we place these resources.
Well, thank you so much. What is the timeline looking like for this? In terms of, I'm just trying to get at where we're looking at in terms of the timeline for being able to get some more info. But
I actually forget what our schedule was. We're doing 3 separate scenarios, right? So NISO, if we have time today, NISO is going to present on the second scenario, at least the zonal capacity results. But I think we're still working through the placement of the resources in the state scenario, which we've had those zonal capacity results for quite a while. Then we will move into this second scenario that NISO would be presenting on hopefully today. That is still a bit of a consuming process. And again, we don't even have the third scenario as capacity expansion model results. So I forget the exact schedule, but probably into the fall.
all right. Well, thank you. Again, more info, transparency request. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'll stop because I want to see that NISO preso.
I don't think I see any more hands at the moment. Any final questions for Jeff and the JU team? Okay, in that case, I think we'll, at roughly the halfway point, I think we'll switch over to the New York ISO to present the capacity expansion modeling results for the second scenario of the CGBP. So just to set the stage for everybody, again, we've already seen the first scenario results, which is sometimes called the state scenario in the New York ISO's Outlook process. This one is the second scenario. This is the scenario that's built off of a bunch of assumptions that lead to, projected to lead to a lower transmission impact once we get through the rest of the CGPP. So now I'll turn over to the NISO to talk through the scenario.
Yeah, thanks for that, Skylar. This is Keith Burrell from the New York ISO. Our primary presenter today will be Kevin Ravas to walk us through scenario 2 key findings. I think, Kevin, we're certainly seeing your screen. Let's do a quick audio check to see if we can hear you.
Yep, mic check. Thank you, Keith. Can you hear me?
Yep,
Sounds
you're
good.
good. Go ahead and take it away.
Okay, excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Skylar. So yeah, like Skylar and Keith mentioned, we're going to be going over the CGBP Scenario 2 results. And, just to note, the Scenario 2 results are also being referred to as the low transmission impact scenario. And that's something that's been defined by the joint utilities here. So you may see these used interchangeably. So on the agenda for today, we'll talk about the assumptions in scenario 2 and what has changed between the state scenario and this low transmission impact scenario. I have the results both at a NICA and zonal level included in this presentation. And then finally, we will talk about the scenarios and how they compare to each other. And there's also some appendix information that I can give an overview on, but will primarily are just provided for information purposes. So this scenario 2 here is based off of the state scenario that was studied in the System and Resource Outlook that is on its way to being published by the NISO here. And, as I mentioned, the definition of this scenario as a low transmission impact scenario is a definition that has been given to us by the joint utilities. And the assumption changes for scenario 2 have also been provided by the joint utilities here. So getting into those assumptions and what has changed. So relative to the state scenario, there is a lower storage cost that's being assumed, and that is according to the NYSERDA integration analysis. So, you know, I have these highlighted in bullets, but I'm also going to quantify them in the next slides here. We also have a higher statewide DER forecast, and that's according to the NYSERDA distributed solar roadmap. And then finally, we have more EV load flexibility, and that's according to a high end use flexibility data that's provided in the NYSERDA integration analysis as well. All the other assumptions outside of the three highlighted here are consistent with the state scenario. And in addition to the slides, we also have an assumptions matrix that is either been provided or will be provided. It's a Word document that's in a table form that has all of the assumptions outlined and shows how they change relative to one another. And that includes scenarios that are in the Outlook as well as the CGPP. So we can see how all of those scenarios compare to one another. So getting into the quantification of how these assumptions compare to each other is, you know, in this figure, I'm showing how the storage costs, the capital costs, change over time. And we can see in scenario 2, we're talking about roughly a 20% lower battery capital cost in 2025 and a 12% lower capital cost in 2042. And this is just highlighting zones A through F, just for, you know, information, whereas zones G through K have slightly higher capital costs, but the rate of decline is the same in those zones as well. On the behind the meter PV, here we have a comparison, the blue line being the state scenario and the orange line being scenario 2. And so scenario 2 in 2042 has a 40% higher behind the meter forecast. And then finally, on the flexible EV capacity, again, blue line state scenario, orange line scenario 2. Scenario 2 has about a 30% more flexibility in 2042. So with that, I'm going to start to get into the results here.
Big chance we might have missed our entry though. With one tick. In one tick, we missed it.
I'm sorry, was there a question and I couldn't hear it very clearly?
Yeah, Kevin, I think that was just somebody that didn't realize they were not on mute.
Got it. Thank you, Keith. Okay, so this next set of slides is the results for scenario 2, and let's start with the key findings. So scenario 2 is showing a decrease in UPV, and that is due to an increase in the behind the meter PV. So there's additional behind the meter generation driven by that change in assumptions. And then in addition, due to the lower capital costs of the battery, we're seeing more battery, particularly the 8-hour storage that is being built in zone J. And that's offsetting upstate hydrogen. So hydrogen defer, and a reminder that hydrogen defer in this scenario is simple cycle and combined cycle combustion turbines. So we're seeing this storage offset those defer units in terms of capacity and also offsetting a little bit of UPV. So in terms of the results here, I'm going to discuss the content of what's here for the scenario 2 results. But when it comes to the analysis, we have some scenario comparison slides where I think it'll be least repetitive if I just get to those slides. So I just want to show here that we have the scenario 2 results at a NICA level, and we have capacity and generation. And then we have an upstate versus downstate view, which is showing the cumulative capacity additions. And this is only capacity that is added, not the existing capacity. We have the capacity additions by zone, and this is at the end state in 2042. And then we have headroom here. So this is the existing headroom and the incremental headroom. So we've sort of touched on headroom in previous EPAC conversations. So, but headroom is essentially a representation of local transmission capability before reaching the bulk system. And the existing and or planned headroom is represented by the solid blue bars, whereas the headroom that the model adds is the dashed bar on top of that. We have the storage results, which are showing the 4-hour duration and the 8-hour duration by zone. And then similarly, we have the hydrogen build by type and distinguishing between retrofits and new units. We have the electrolysis load, and this is the annual energy and how that changes over time and distributed in the upstate zones A through E. And in this scenario, we're seeing a slight increase in the electrolysis in this scenario due to a little bit more hydrogen deferred generation. And then finally, we have the representative days, which this is sort of the what the model is seeing. It has the 13 unique days that it does its capacity expansion for. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take that at the end of the presentation here, but just wanted to give an overview of the content to remind folks. And then finally, this is where I want to get into like the meat of the conversation here. And let's start with looking at how things are different between the state scenario and scenario 2 at the NICA level. So here we can see the side-by-side look, and we're seeing the scenario 2 has a lower installed capacity of UPV, and that's driven by an increase in the behind-the-meter PV. So you can see how those numbers change between the scenarios, but also what we have here on the next slide is a delta slide. So this is either the increase or decrease relative to the state scenario. And so we're seeing, and better quantified, more energy storage, more 8-hour energy storage. And, that 8-hour storage has a high ELCC. So in addition to, there's a change in load that's occurring here, load flexibility. And it's offsetting, the energy storage is offsetting some hydrogen and UPV capacity. And in addition, the behind the meter PV doesn't contribute to firm capacity. But since there is more included in scenario 2, there is a net in total installed capacity increase. And then looking at the generation, so we're seeing the UPV generation is being offset by the behind the meter PV that's added. So now getting into the zonal comparison. So from an upstate perspective, we're seeing results that are very similar. One of the most significant changes in scenario 2 is actually downstate, and that is in zone J. And we're seeing more of the battery being added to zone J due to the reduced cost. And just looking at this in another way, which I think will be helpful for folks, is seeing the zonal comparison here by scenario. So within each zone, you've got the state scenario and scenario 2 side by side. So now you can easily see how things are changing in this new scenario. So getting to the quantification of some other factors here, we've looked at how headroom changed between the scenarios. And this is just showing the delta to what the model chose to add between the scenarios. And the results are showing that, you know, there's only a change of less than 1 gigawatts at maximum, and I believe that's occurring in zone C here in 2042. So the results are fairly consistent from a headroom perspective. And then we put the storage side by side as well, so we can see how that's changing. So scenario 2, upstate, you know, there is some increase in some zones, some shifting that's occurring in the upstate zones, but primarily seeing an increase in zone J here. And now in scenario 2, whereas in state scenario, we only had the 4-hour storage duration in zone J, now we're getting some 8-hour storage. And then finally here, I have the comparison of the hydrogen build. And we can see that downstate, the hydrogen build is very similar as the state scenario. But because of the additional storage that's coming in this scenario 2, we're seeing a reduced need for hydrogen capacity. And it's especially apparent in the upstate zones here that there's a reduction happening. So that is roughly the end of my presentation here. Just to highlight what's in the appendix, there are some additional slides for scenario 2, just to see the cumulative capacity additions over the different model years. We also have the representative days for different model years. And then finally, we have some CGPP assumptions that are available to review, giving background on the state scenario and other important assumptions that are present in both scenarios. And then finally, the state scenario results as they were discussed at the June 17 EPAC are also available in this slide deck. But with that, I'm going to pause and take any questions.
Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Skylar. Bill Ackern, Professor. Just you wanted to understand a little more on how you're modeling the increased flexibility of the EV load in this scenario. Could you explain a little more of how that's done?
Yeah, so we have some load inputs that are coming from NYSERDA on this flexibility. So we basically have an amount of change in peak loading that occurs because of the flexibility. And so we're able to take that basically quantified amount of megawatts and distribute that zonally. And in this case, we're just seeing more of that. And this flexibility also contributes to like firm as firm capacity and therefore reduces the need for some additional resources. But does that answer your question, or can I provide some more color on that?
Yeah, I think it's getting there. And how much more flexible EV load did you add in this scenario?
Yeah, so I think this slide captures it best. You know, the blue line in this case is the state scenario, and then the orange line is for this new scenario 2. So, you know, 30% more and about 1,000 or so more megawatts. And that's just like capacity. That's not necessarily the energy, but about 1,000 or a little bit more than that in 2042.
Okay.
And just to add one more thing, the EV assumption was that they can shift their load up to 12 hours. So literally from without having to spend any energy to do so.
So you said up to 12 hours?
Yes, for the EVs, the EV load flexibility.
Okay, this is exactly what I'm trying to press on here, because what I'm surprised at is that I would expect if you have over a gigawatt of EV flexibility, that would almost be a direct gigawatt reduction in peaker capacity. And you know, I think what's going on here is that because if we're only shifting the EV load within a day and not shifting it intraday, we might be missing a lot of peak load reduction ability from the EV flexibility, and that's kind of why I was asking the question, because I'm a little surprised that your peaker plants didn't, and you talked a little about the small effect on the hydrogen peakers, but I would have expected more of a peaker reduction in the scenario, and it sounds like part of it might be the fact that we're only intraday shifting the load and not intraday shifting the load. But maybe if you want to comment, folks want to comment more on that or think more about that area.
Yeah, certainly agreed that the model is only considering inter-day flexibility. I guess, you know, just to your point, right, we're seeing, because there's more load flexibility, we're seeing more firm capacity being added to the system for that reason, which is kind of explaining how these resources get shifted. We have more flexibility and more energy storage that's offsetting the hydrogen and the UPV. But in terms of the quantification, or like perhaps the expectation, I think the model is performing as expected, but perhaps because it's not intraday, it's just slightly different than what would be expected otherwise. So hopefully that helps a little.
It does. You know, I think I've said this a number of times in these meetings. Obviously we can't change it this cycle, but I think it's going to be a really important thing for us to look at going forward the next cycle of this process. Thanks.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. Are there any other hands at the moment?
Oh, one just popped up. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation here. Could you go to slide 26? Yeah, I think this was also probably similar to the state scenario, but could you comment on why most of the build out is between F through K and not upstate, A through E?
Yeah, I think part of this has to do with LCR, and we have G through J, we have zones J and K modeled with LCR requirements. And therefore, I think there's some like economic efficiency that happens here where the model is preferring the downstate zones because it feeds into the entire IRM that is NICA-wide. So I think it's economically driven, but from those constraints.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. And then could you go to slide 17? Yeah, I probably made this comment before, but I do appreciate the electrolysis load being put upstate, but could you comment a little bit on how it's modeled? Is it a base load, a constant load, or is it trying to minimize over generation upstate? Because I mean, we saw in the outlook that Central East is a problem, and with this electrolysis load, I'm assuming it's going to reduce the congestion on Central East, so it becomes more critical for this load to be in service. So I just want to bring that up and get your thoughts.
Yeah, I can certainly comment on like the modeling methodology here. So yeah, we've kept the electrolysis load only in zones A through E, and the capacity expansion model does have the ability to optimize when it wants to serve this load. So the model is optimizing it, and there's two parts to the electrolysis load as a whole. There's electrolysis that is based on quote unquote rest of state electrolysis. So this is hydrogen needs that are beyond the electric sector, for other industries or sectors. And then in addition to that, there is the electrolysis that's correlated to how much the hydrogen DFR units are running within the scenario. So to try to help paint that picture a little clearer, like a lot of this electrolysis is coming from that rest of state. And I would say that it's the majority of it is coming from the rest.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to emphasize that it's somewhat reducing the impact of potential congestion upstate, right? I mean, we're building about 25 gigawatt hours of electrolysis upstate. So my thought there was, if that doesn't materialize or it's spread out more broadly, we could see more problems upstate.
I think that's a really good observation. That's something that has changed in my thinking since when we first kicked off the study. When you're first scoping this and we're thinking, oh, we're probably going to need to make some hydrogen to fulfill this DFR. How are we going to make enough energy or be able to site electrolyzers to make that hydrogen? But then when you really get into the results and the huge quantities of renewables we're putting upstate, it almost becomes a new resource for you. The electrolyzers load becomes this resource that you can kind of move around, and we've given the model a lot of flexibility to site both site the resources and utilize the resources when and where it really needs it. And in that way, it's almost becoming kind of a zero cost storage resource in the exact places that are kind of causing a lot of the congestion. And so in addition to kind of the concept that you brought up, where obviously, utilizing this type of stuff and reducing potential overloads from, high renewable concentrations during low load times when they could just charge and they make hydrogen basically. It's also potentially used during regular days to reduce congestion on certain interfaces. And so that's something that could really impact the results. And part of that makes me really happy that we have this kind of synergy, but part of it also gives me heartburn because the electrolysis is something that we have a little bit less control over, or at least a lot less of a line of sight towards right now, like today. And this kind of presumes we're going to have a significant quantity of it exactly when and where we need it, and not necessarily seeing them show up as massive new loads on the electrical network, which could actually cause new different issues that we haven't identified yet. So there's a lot going on here when we talk about electrolysis, and we'll have to parse a lot of it, especially through stage 2, but then in the future as we're kind of thinking through what this means for the future build-outs of renewables and transmission in the state. And Sarah, I saw your hand go up. Want to say something?
Yeah, thanks, Skylar. So this is Sarah Karkner from the NISO. I just wanted to thank Kofi for the comment there and Skylar for the reply on that. And just, wanted to say in regards to the electrolysis load, and I know there was a reference back to the outlook there. Just want to caution folks against drawing any conclusions. Certainly, the scenarios are very different here and just more analysis would be needed to draw any conclusions on that point. But to your point before, there is, a significant amount of electrolysis load here in the upstate zones, and that certainly would, impact the results as we're seeing even from a capacity expansion perspective, let alone what we may see through additional analysis. But thanks again for all the comments and discussion on this.
Thanks. And is there, what's the status of sensitivities? Is that window already closed? Or do we plan to have a discussion on sensitivities again?
Those discussions are ongoing right now. We've taken some information, from these first 2 scenarios to try to identify, what's the most important thing we really need to test. To a certain extent, we are kind of constrained with what sensitivities we can run because the order is very clear that we want to be able to test out the flexibility on the bulk transmission. And trying to kind of determine what interfaces, if we relax them in the capacity expansion model, how would that impact the results? And so that's going to eat into most of our time to run sensitivities. We might only have a couple that we might be able to fit in to test some of these interesting kind of nice to know type kind of questions, but happy to take any comments or suggestions there.
Yep, thank you.
Any other questions for Kevin? Okay. You can always reach out after the meeting too if something pops into your head. Feel free to shoot us an email. The EPAC email is always open for those questions. We can try to find answers. So I think that's all we had planned for today. As I mentioned before, there's a couple of things coming up. We're trying to get through capacity expansion modeling results for scenario 3. Those probably won't be ready for a couple weeks, so I don't think we can necessarily schedule the meeting for a week or 2 from today because we just don't know if those will be ready. But at the moment, I'm tentatively targeting that first full week of August as a potential for our next meeting, where we'll hopefully have scenario 3 results to share as well. In the meantime, we're gonna take any incoming that comes between now and then, but also we'll do some digging on what else we might be able to do in terms of tracking locations or tracking any additional information around megawatts and interconnection points or anything like that related to the DAC discussion, and we'll come prepared next time to talk a little bit more about that as well. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining, and we'll talk again in a few weeks.
Thanks, everybody.